Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of the War Report. And we got quite a bit of a show ahead of you. Now, it may have seemed like it was a slow news week, but it really wasn't. Just a lot of stuff brewing under the surface. And I figured we should start with none other than where is our president? Where has he gone? I mean, you have Joe Biden. You're supposed to have the return to normal. What we riffed on that in our last episode at the title, but it is as we're recording this. March 6th, and he still has not given a State of the Union. Now, if you want to get technical, it would be a joint session of Congress addressed by the president because the year he got elected or whatever. But point being is, Biden is still not given some sort of speech that would lay out the State of the Union, especially in such a crucial time where he wants to return to normal and we need to get back on track. We need to give America some respectability again. Now, of course, this is all on top of several red states, including Texas, Arizona. Well, Florida never closed down, but some of them are lifting restrictions for COVID and mask restrictions and business restrictions and trying to return life to a quote unquote normal. A lot of the governors are rebelling against this, and it looks like more and more states are going along. There's even some sympathies within blue states because even though it is often painted as a partisan issue and it does generally fall down upon partisan lines, there's plenty of people who wouldn't necessarily be Republicans or people who supported Trump that are getting sick of this. They may have even supported this at first, but think, okay, enough is enough. We need to do something about it. But that's beside the point. And of course, they passed this $1.9 trillion relief bill, which again is yet another. We're going to shove a bunch of things that aren't have nothing to do with this into this relief bill, and that was the big debate over the raising the minimum wage. People were mad at the Senate for not including that in the bill, even though there were certain Senate rules that allowed them to not include that in the bill because of procedural issues. Typical parliamentary stuff. I know they were blaming the Senate parliamentarian. That's who the leftists were mad at this week. But point being is, we're watching the mismanagement of an empire in real time. Now we've been watching that for the past several years, but it just seems so abundantly clear now. And maybe it's bias from the past. What would it be? 12 years between Obama and Trump, both of whom were massive media hogs. Who it was a press conference for every little thing. I'm not saying that Bush wasn't in the media at all, but compared to Obama and Trump, not at all. But again, it seems like Biden has been completely radio silent. Even Kamala has been completely radio silent. And it honestly feels like, for better and for worse, sometimes it's nice, that we don't have a president right now, that it's just the regime running itself. It's the so called deep state, the bureaucratic administration running the state on its own, independent of the senile old man sitting in the White House right now.
Well, I mean, it's very transparent, isn't it? That it is now truly a regime-run state, right? So it's not the one particular leader. He's not particularly popular, even though he's the most beloved president America's ever had. Um, Kamala seems to be doing most of the heavy lifting, phoning Benjamin Netanyahu finally, and Macron, and this week Trudeau. Um, but this is a very new precedent. Previously, a vice president, he was there for some kind of a function on the White House in garden, you know, would give a speech, sometimes in support of the president when really needed, but generally very much outside of the picture. And you're seeing Kamala in a very new role. And of course, I mean, we know why, because, Biden's senility is more apparent than Reagan's Alzheimer's. So, I mean, it is what it is. They cannot risk to have him uh, have so many public speeches unrehearsed or even rehearsed for that matter, because they simply don't know what the
Yeah, they can't
fallout
have
might
him
be.
having an Anderson Cooper moment where he grilled him on stage about the about the San Francisco bathhouse. If you remember that clip from
Yeah.
from last year, again, they can't have moments like that. I mean, on the campaign trail, you could get away with it. You could do damage control, but now that the guy's in the White House and they need to put on some image of seriousness and them actually holding power, that has to be done away with.
Right, and I think he's under the illusion that he has an N-word pass. He doesn't.
He is Irish after all. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. So he
So,
might. He might.
so we're seeing something very unprecedented taking place, and like you say, it's a mismanagement of an empire, but it's the transparency that's coming through um, that I think you can't stop and stare. It is like a an unfortunate accident on the highway. Um, you don't want to look, but you can't help but look. Um, Yeah. So, and then meanwhile, in the backdrop, we still have the military occupation of the Capitol building and the
Yes, March
surrounding
4th
area.
was supposed to be the uprising where
That's
Trump
right.
rides back into Washington D.C. on the back of a white steed, sword drawn from the sheath and everything, holding a Q flag in the other hand, and just charging in and overthrowing the regime and becoming the rightful, what is it, 19th president. That's the theory they were on for a while, that we haven't had a president since 18, I think it was 1876 or whatever. But that's what they were on. So there was this massive occupation of the Capitol, and in anticipation of this uprising, of course, it was all the like lowest of the low National Guards, the people who would never see a day deployment of combat because they are just not physically or mentally fit. Again, you get the you get the 35-year-old obese women who probably work a desk job otherwise because the National Guard, the fit, capable members actually capable of fighting, are either deployed somewhere so-called strategically, or somewhere that's more so-called important than guarding the Capitol from some alleged uprising. So again, I will admit, when they had the occupations of the Capitol both times, yeah, I'm not saying our National Guard is like a world class fighting force by no means. I do think especially standards have dropped in the past few years. But they took the lowest of the low because they knew that this was not a serious threat at all. They took the people who would have just been doing literally anything else. Janitors, for example. Hey, take a rifle and you go stand by this national monument. We need a photo op for the Washington Post, or stuff like that. But point being is, it was only a handful of people who showed up for this, and it was just like a demonstration. They had signs, they had pro-Trump signs, they had QAnon signs, but this was supposed to be the giant revolt, and apparently it was based on, we used to inaugurate presidents, I believe, actually on March 4th or at the beginning of March before. I think that was the 22nd Amendment. Point being is, it sometime in the 20th century it changed to January, but it, it
Yeah.
was it was one of these flexes of power, which you do think it's strange that they take the probably the least competent members of our military and use them for the photo ops. You figured at least they would get some guys who've had some time in Iraq or Afghanistan, even just not keeping them in the capital, at least getting them for the photo ops. Look, big scary.
Yeah.
These were guys who were off overseas fighting in tribal conflicts, and they've seen some shit, so to speak. But no, they get the desk jockeys and give them some rifles. Like I really don't understand what the rationale. Like I understand what the rationale is, but I don't understand how they're executing it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you only have two FBI agents and a handful of Discord members show up to try their hand again to take over the American government, you don't have to worry about it.
This is going to be like a Napoleon III
Trump is still
situation, isn't
going.
it?
Trump is always going to be fishing on the Rubicon, not crossing
Oh, of course, of course. But I'm just saying, are we in for like a Napoleon III situation where they just fake
it.
us out with a bunch of really bad coup attempts that nobody takes seriously, and then all of a sudden he's back in power again? Like, maybe that's wishful thinking, but that's what it feels like at this point.
Well, I mean, I think it serves two purposes. One is the January 16th riot was farcical. Um, by and large, it was farcical. They called it a deadly riot, but then that is only in the most skimmest of interpretations. One person died, a Trump supporter who was shot at point blank range,
Yeah, by by
and
by by a cop.
everybody else died the next day of a heart attack. Literally, the only people that died were Trump supporters, and no one still knows what happened to that policeman who died a day later. It's been ruled out that he was beaten with a fire extinguisher. That has been ruled out now, according to the coronary reports. So I think it serves two purposes. One is to make people believe that it was not farcical and really was dangerous, or there was ever a chance that the American government was going to be overturned. To that, you could add that it's there to, of course, demonize the Republican Party. But the other function is, I think, to symbolically say that we're not sure that this farce might next time be repeated in a more effective way, and it isn't technically a farce. So I think now, whether you believe that will happen, that there'll be an attempt, an actual armed insurrection, not a non-armed insurrection. Um, who knows? I don't know, but they want you to believe that that could happen at any time, right? So they're trying to give the effect that America is under a crisis, and they're trying to consolidate power around one narrative, one interpretation of events, and not another. Right? That's the whole point of it, is to consolidate the power, to have a more centralized structure to America going forward, and that has a particular kind of ideology and a particular kind of narrative and a particular way of interpreting events. So that's what it's there for. It is very much like a cultural revolution, when Mao's revolution wasn't going that well, a cultural revolution was started, which basically accused teachers and other people who never had a chance to actually take over and steer the country, that they were in fact plotting to do that, and the threat was imminent and it could happen at any time, and it worked, but it worked at a cost, to the point that the Chinese are not willing to talk about this anymore, because in a sense they knew it was a crisis that was created, and in very much the same way that's what's happening in the U.S.
So speaking of Capitol Hill, the Senate has had a very busy week between two different events. Beyond just the COVID relief bill, which again we went over, all you need to know, just more frivolous money, and you might get your $1,400 check, but I wouldn't hold your breath for it for a lot of people. And one of the main lamentations of the left, which I've quite enjoyed, is that Biden has given us less money than Trump did. But yeah, yeah, that's I found that humorous. But several senators in a bipartisan commission led by Marco Rubio, they're calling on the Biden administration to put pressure on Venezuelan President Maduro to step down and recognize the democratically elected leader of Brazil, Juan Guaido. That's a name I have not heard in a while. The same man who Trump allegedly dismissed and gave up on for not wearing a wedding ring, which I thought was kind of funny. But it looks like they're really pushing this Venezuela thing again. And you know what Venezuela fits the theme of in areas that Biden has been targeting in several ways, whether that be Germany and Russia, the Middle East, the Caucasus. You know what Venezuela also has that those places have,
uh, Oil
and natural gas, but
and natural gas. Yeah.
energy resources is what I'm getting at.
Yes.
And after Biden destroyed I'm going to outright say it, Biden has destroyed the American domestic energy industry. I'm not saying it's broken beyond repair, but as it stands, the American domestic energy industry has been wrecked by Biden, and I will say that unequivocally. He's gotten us dug in deeper in the Middle East. He considered sanctioning Saudi Arabia over the Khashoggi assassination. He's after Nord Stream 2. And again, is this just his 4D chess sort of thing against the global energy markets? What's he trying to do here? And it looks like, at least on the sense part, they want him to take further action in Venezuela. They want him to put more pressure on the regime, because if we just put a little bit more sanctions, if we just do a little bit more, I'm sure Maduro will fall from power. It's not like his regime has been stabilized by outside money, by Russia and China. It's not like we missed our opportunity to do that too. Like, hell, 7 years ago, back when he first came to power. It's not like we missed our opportunity then. But yeah, we can still do it because Marco Rubio has his interest from his donors and his ethnic interest. I'm sure Venezuela will crumble and they can be a liberal democratic paradise ruled by ruled by a childless lesbian if we just try hard enough. And I'm pretty sure Guaido is childless, and also pretty sure he's a lesbian. So he fits the bill. He fits the bill.
F the optics. Yeah, yeah. I think Biden is so far disappointing a lot of people, which I guess ultimately means that his administration itself is divided because no one can seriously think that Biden is really doing anything except listening to when he's being coached, and even that isn't
Salute
something
the
that's
Marines. That's my
yeah,
that's one of my favorite Biden moments so far, where he just
yeah,
set. I mean, look, all presidents wear the earpiece. If you're that important, you got to have that sort of
yeah.
instantaneous communication. And again, especially when you're new in the office, they give you this sort of instructions. But the fact that he didn't have the mental capacity to actually do it and repeated it, I think that I think that says more than it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's not looking good. The optics are bad. Orange Hitler is gone, but America is still not in a good spot. Let's say that.
Yeah, a lot of people, even within the establishment, had this crazy idea that all they needed was a change in who was in the White House for things to return to normal. Like Trump had not done irreparable damage, which they kept on saying he did irreparable damage. Yet they thought getting rid of him would undo that for whatever reason. Now, of course, a lot of that was narrative, a lot of that was rhetoric, but it seems like in the end they started to buy into their own narrative a little bit, if not entirely.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's presence did do that because, as I've said on many episodes prior, that the media could have handled this in a different way by still showing support for anyone but Trump. But instead, what happened? They became like some strange corporate activist arm of America, and it was nonstop demonizing coverage of Trump from day one. I think maybe the only time they had some legitimacy is the way Trump handled COVID. But the fact of the matter is that much of the country was divided, and much of the country's elites did react too late, and that fell on both Democrats and Republicans, including notable Democrats like Feinstein, Pelosi, Cuomo, Newsom, who all dismissed the virus early on.
Yeah, just go to Chinatown, enjoy Chinese New Year, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it wasn't handled correctly, but they effectively did switch all the blame to him, and like I say, so they've made their own crises, and in a way, it's similar to the way these transparencies are presenting themselves to us now. The way, let's say, the feeling that Biden really isn't in control of anything else. That all of this has to be managed by several teams in the background, and that you have to be okay with that. And in the same way, let's say um, Trump's rhetoric did have a tremendous appeal, but in the way that they handled it, um, they turned it into this moment of chaos. And that I mean, nobody believed that the country was capable of splitting more than they did. At least that's the way they presented it. Now, do I really think they thought they would split? No, I don't. But that was kind of the implicit message.
Well, I
Um,
think their biggest fear at the end of the day, and I think that materialized on January 6th, was an apathetic population, a population that just did not care anymore. And I think they've
Yeah.
gotten that. I think they've most
Yes.
definitely gotten that.
Yeah. I mean, they're just as responsible for quote unquote radicalizing, the boomer insurgents on January 6th as anybody else. Um, yeah. So I don't, nobody knows where it'll go from here. There isn't really any, like, no emerging politician is going to be able to escape, um, the Democrat establishment, uh, magnet, so to speak, in the same way that you saw Bernie Sanders bend the knee. You see it with AOC. Always, when push comes to shove, she will side with Mama Pelosi. They all do, in the same way that um, they've had to acquiesce. That is the establishment, and it's not going to change now. Um, Sanders, bowing to Clinton was obviously an admission that he really wasn't actually interested in winning, when it came right down to it. Uh, so there isn't anybody really in the wings. Not that I promote Bernie Sanders or AOC. That's not what I'm saying. But if we're just going to talk about somebody emerging that can shake this up, it's not going to happen. Um, that force is there. You can view it every day in the military perimeter around the Capitol building. Like, it's just going to be managed from like the lower levels now, and we're going to move into an era of just figureheads.
Well, with that being said, there's more news about Nord Stream 2. Now, apparently,
Mm.
the Danish Maritime Authority revealed a Russian pipeline vessel named the Academic Chersky would soon be joining Nord Stream 2, which would potentially speed up the construction of the project. And both sides of the Senate, Republican and Democrat alike, are rather concerned about this, with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is a member of the Foreign Relations Armed Service Committees, and she's a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, said, "quote Time is running out here to get something done before the pipeline is completed." And it stepped up with Ted Cruz refusing to. He voted not to hear the nominations for Biden's CIA director until, quote, "I'll release my hold when the Biden administration meets its legal obligation to report and sanction the ships and companies building Putin's pipeline." So there's outrage in the Senate over Nord Stream 2, as expected, and it looks like Biden has really refused to touch this issue, or Biden's administration has really refused to touch this issue, because one of the big points of the campaign was restoring America's image to its allies, and particularly Germany. They didn't want to antagonize the Germans any more than Trump already had. So it looks like they're at least behind the scenes tolerating Nord Stream 2 because they don't want to enrage the Germans anymore and drive them even further away from us. But it creates the contradiction we've seen since at least the Trump administration, if not earlier, where NATO is necessary because Russia is a threat to Europe. Yet Germany does not feel threatened enough by Russia to the point where they buy Russian oil and gas. And then when the United States says to Germany, you must not feel threatened by Russia because you're willing to trade with energy with them, with such a vital resource, Germany says you're alienating us and you're pulling NATO apart. So it's this self-feeding system
Yeah.
that when you call it out, you calling out Nord Stream 2 is the equivalent of calling out NATO, because at least the way Trump did it, because like I said, if you're comfortable enough to trade with Russia in terms of energy and have them provide your energy, you're clearly not afraid of a Russian invasion of Europe anytime soon. Now, a lot of the Eastern European states, whether it's paranoia or genuine, which is my personal opinion is paranoia, I think the Baltic states and Poland do fear a Russian
Mm.
invasion. But when you
Yeah.
get to Central Europe and Western Europe, less so. A lot of them want to lift sanctions on Russia. Which, funny enough, that's actually the position of the so-called far left and the so-called far right, where the AFD has been a big proponent of this in Germany, lifting trade restrictions on Russia. But Biden, again, is between a rock and a hard place when it comes to this, because what is the Biden administration to do? Are they supposed to crack down on Nord Stream 2, which angers Germany, or are they supposed to let Russia completely keep dominating them in their so-called sphere of influence?
Mm.
Germany has been on the American sphere of influence in part since 1945, completely since the reunification in 1990. It's it's a lose-lose situation, because no matter what you do, you either invalidate NATO or you anger the Germans, who are a key player in NATO. There's really no way out of this, and frankly, I go back to this
Yeah.
point all the time. Trump's early proposals for foreign policy, especially under Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor, was a bit of a retreat in shoring up, realizing the contradictions of the system, that's not sustainable, that you will anger one party or another, and we really need to redirect our foreign policy if we're to maintain a serious business on the world stage. But of course, Flynn got thrown to the wolves, and of course, people like McMaster and
Hmm.
Bolton, and I think Robert O'Brien, whoever the hell he was the guy who replaced Bolton. But point being is, it shows the fundamental dysfunction of the American empire, that it cannot juggle these two interests. These things are just, they cannot click, because they're not willing to cede any ground to Russia, which, that's one thing. If you're willing to say, we're willing to accept Russia as more of an equal partner, if you will, or tolerate their existence. But until they make that concession, which is too late to make that concession with the way they've been interacting with China, and of course, we more or less pushed them there. But the ultimate point is, there's really no winning move for the American foreign policy establishment out of this conundrum.
Yes. If Germany had been a lesser and more unsuccessful state with much larger, let's say, financial and economic issues, they could do something about it. But the fact is, Germany is on mainland Europe the most successful state,
The
and they
economic
can't.
engine of Europe.
Yeah, and so they simply can't. Um, Now I'm still surprised that they couldn't figure out uh, a way to entice Germany away from making this move. Um, I really thought that Trump had done enough damage that uh, that the Biden would just have to literally seal the deal, that there wasn't going to be a pipeline, and in before somebody says, but 94% was already completed. Well, I mean, yeah, in a way that supports my argument, because it would be such a cynical move, and it would ultimately punish Germany and hurt Russia to such an extent after so much was built, that it would be a formidable lesson that would be learned. But that didn't take place, and even after Biden canceled the Keystone, which I thought was a clear sign that he was going to be tenacious about stopping Nord Stream 2, but that didn't happen either. So it's frankly shocking. I really cannot believe that this happened. Um, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but because I said this the last show. Yeah, here we are. Um, Germany's actions in and of themselves could divide NATO in the EU, of course. Um, in a way, what must be happening in the backroom talks and the talks with Kamala on the phone are probably words to the effect of, "We can handle the Poles and whatever other state is against Nord Stream 2. Britain is no longer in the EU, so it doesn't have a voice anyways." You could argue from a NATO point of view that it does, but it doesn't have the complete package in the way that Germany and France do. And whatever Macron might say, and he has been relatively quiet about it, he has not said very much. And so that would lead me to believe that the two biggest countries are not against Nord Stream 2. And it's for those little countries like Poland and perhaps Hungary, the Baltic states. Although even Hungary has not condemned Nord Stream 2.
Or is Hungary a
Not,
beneficiary of Turk Stream?
yeah, it is. But there you have it. So you have some smaller states that and frankly, they're also worried about something else. They're worried, let's say from Poland's point of view, that Nord Stream 2 will just simply embolden on either side two countries that Poland has been at war with many times over the last few centuries, and that it will not just create more Russian influence, it will create more German influence. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine has made Nord Stream 1 unreliable after the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's why there's a Nord Stream 2. And America's had many, many years, well over 2 decades, to come up with a better solution, and it has not. So,
Well, I think one element we need to consider is uranium, pardon the pun. Now, the Germans have had an aversion to nuclear power since Fukushima happened in Japan in 2011, so about 10 years now. And that's when they started decommissioning a lot of their plants, and I'm sure we'll see the nuclear shills come out eventually and say, well, Germany just needs to adopt nuclear. And I'm not saying that they won't or they won't consider returning to it, but one thing you also have to consider, and this doesn't necessarily play in Nord Stream 2, is nuclear, when it comes to extracting the uranium you need to run the plants or just the material the plants are made out of, completely reliant on oil, natural gas, and other petroleum products to even function. But I'm curious if we're going to see a big push for nuclear in Germany and Europe as a whole to try to counteract Russian influence, which also creates another interesting paradigm because the Russians, I believe they're one of the top countries in the world when it comes to manufacturing parts needed for nuclear power plants, and that they've assisted
they
the
are.
Iranian plants a lot, and I think even like the Chinese plants early on. Now I imagine China has its own industry, but point being is Russia has assisted Iran and several of the other Central Asian countries in building nuclear power plants. So that may become a point of contention soon, the push for nuclear, but we'll have to see further down the road. And again, it is one of these situations where there's really no. They kicked the can down the road too long, and now they're panicking because they realize the implications of what they actually did. Now, with
Mhm.
that being said, let's talk about Ukraine. So we got
Yeah, I
quite a
mean,
quite a bit of news out of
Ukraine is
Ukraine.
always interesting.
Oh, so the first news story, which is strange enough the less interesting one, is Ukraine calls for help to calm frontline quote unquote escalation. Now, there's been renewed tensions between the separatists in Ukraine, in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, and the pro government militias and the Ukrainian forces fighting the pro Russian separatists. And it looks like they're really pushing for a ceasefire, and Zelensky is very adamant about this. He wants to really put an end to this sort of conflict. Now, you'll recall he was elected 2 years ago when he took office in May of 2019. He campaigned on, well, we have to put down these sort of rebellions in eastern Ukraine, but he also threw some bones to the other side by saying, well, after we put down these illegitimate republics, perhaps we can have referendums on their autonomy and their state within the Ukrainian state, blah, 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 blah. Back when it looked like he was going to be more conciliatory towards Russia, but we just saw how that turned out. And in
Yeah.
related news, he did ban coronavirus vaccines from the quote unquote aggressor Russia. So yeah, that's you're really owning the Ruskies there, letting your population go unvaccinated. I mean, I'm again think what you will about the coronavirus vaccine, but if we're supposed to believe that this is serious and that there needs to be action taken about it, that's just a level of pure. That's just a move of pure spite on like levels I have not seen before.
Right. And
Which I do think also kind of delegitimizes the seriousness of this if it's so horrible that they can
yeah.
forego these just because they so happen to be from Russia.
Right. I guess it's I guess every Ukrainian is not just a victim of COVID, they're also a martyr. That must be the angle they've chosen. This is obviously an order from Washington that under no circumstances are you allowed in any way to have any kind of positive interaction with Russia. And if that means we don't supply you with the vaccine, so be it. But that's been the case. That's been basically the way America has treated Ukraine ever since the crisis, ever since the coup in 2014. So par for the course, and
Yeah, that
you have
that takes
you still have. Go ahead.
that takes into our news about Slovakia because Slovakia,
Yeah.
after Hungary, has become the second European Union state to put on orders for the Russian vaccine. Now, the Prime Minister of Slovakia made a so called unacceptable joke about swapping Ukrainian territory for sooner shipments of the vaccine. Now, he offered the Russians Transcarpathia, which historically was, of course, part of the Austrian Empire, Austria Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and then after World War II was integrated in the Soviet Union under Ukraine, and when it broke up, of course, part of Ukraine. But it's a population of Rusins who are very similar to the Russians and the Ukrainians. They're an Eastern Slavic people as opposed to the Slovaks or Western Slavs. But for years, the Slovaks controlled it either within the confines of another empire, such as Austria, or another state, such as Czechoslovakia. But point being is they have a very deeply tied history. So the Prime Minister of Slovakia, I think, is actually kind of liberal, made this
Mm.
offer to Russia as a tongue-in-cheek sort of manner, and the Ukrainians got mad. Of course, he had to issue the policy, and at the end of his tweet, he put like a little Slava Ukraina thing there, and um, it was funny to see the groveling. But aside from the joke, the point is that again, we have a second European Union state putting on for the Russian vaccine. You had, of course, Merkel saying she won't take the Pfizer vaccine. You, of course, had Macron say he was skeptical of it and probably wouldn't order it for France. Now, I imagine the French have a bit of a sense of pride about themselves whether they're going to try to manufacture their own or within conjunction with another country or eventually cave and accept the American one. But point being is, we're seeing the dastardly Russian influence grow through the trade of medical supplies. It's horrible. Just
If
just
it's if
just,
it
just
if
like
it's
this
not
time
to have
last year when they sent the
success.
medical supplies to various places in Europe, particularly Italy. So it's dastardly,
Yes.
and but I do think the main thing about the fight over the Russian vaccine is, as I just said, I think it undermines their previous point about how severe this actually is because if it was that severe, that deadly of a virus as they're trying to tell us, they would be clamoring for whatever vaccine Russian, Chinese, Iranian, German, French, American, Canadian, British, whatever one they could get, the world would be focused on this. They would put aside any previous conflicts, at least for this one item, but it's clearly not that serious because they're not doing that.
Yeah, and Ukraine continues to have issues. Last week, there were diplomats who were trying to cross over the Polish border who were stopped by the SBU, this is the Security Service of Ukraine, with gold, cigarettes, and foreign currency worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so these diplomats were part of a larger ring of, uh, serving and retired Ukrainian politicians. So, you see this kind of thing happen frequently with Ukraine. Like a few years ago, there were tanks that they acquired from Hungary, no less. And then those tanks were actually sold to the rebels. So it's so ludicrous. I mean, obviously, there's a good portion of the country that does not want to fight. But they're forced in a situation to do so, and otherwise, you would not
What
have
is
these
it? Twenty
kinds of.
five percent of people living in Moscow have a Ukrainian last name.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty high.
Yeah,
Or they have
they're very
like a third have at least one
intermixed.
grandparent
Like
that's
yeah,
Ukrainian.
it's a very intermixed sort of culture now. When you have
Yeah,
two countries that were ruled by the same entity for upwards of 4 centuries, that tends to happen.
yeah, yeah. So you know, Ukraine riddled with problems again. well, again, it's in news to tell you, but it's sort of been going on for quite some time. Now, you mentioned also the Kolomoisky sanctions.
Oh yes, I did. Now,
Yeah.
Biden and Zelensky have teamed up to fight corruption in Ukraine, and it looks like the first individual being targeted is Kolomoisky, who is a Ukrainian of a let's just say Yiddish background for the sake of being polite, who has spent most of his life in America in the Midwest, being what ultimately amounts to a slumlord. He's really big in the real estate thing and buying these old
Yeah.
places and renting them out for really cheap. That's how he made his fortune. He's worth about $1 billion, which, especially when you take that back to Ukraine, he's, I think, one of the richest Ukrainians there is. And it looks like he, who is a supporter of the 2014 revolution, even though he was wishy-washy on it, he went back and forth. He said, "Oh, we need we need to cease hostilities with these separatists and with the Russians. We need to let diplomacy resume." And then he was also a big supporter of Zelensky, this populist candidate, getting funding from one of the country's most prominent oligarchs. Just make whatever sense of that you will.
He was also a supporter of right sector at one time.
Yes, yes, he was all over the place. Yes, he was a supporter of the of the far right. And I will generally call Right Sector a neo-Nazi group because out of all the groups, it actually is. They do carry on swastika banners. They carry around the SS symbols Ukrainians fought under. But yeah, this is the guy. I wish I had that one image on me with that one old Soviet
Yeah.
general in Crimea saying the line. Of course, we'll show those fascists and their Blanco
Yes.
Masonic masters their place. That is one of my favorite images. It gets me every time. But point being is, he's quite literally right. You have these fascists funded by internationalist oligarchs of certain heritages that you wouldn't expect would fund fascists. But that's
Yeah.
beside the point. But it looks like he was an easy first head on the proverbial chopping block. We'll say. Of course, we would never advocate any real violence on the show, but the Biden administration put sanctions on him, and it looks like they're going to try to crack down on so-called corruption in Ukraine, which means probably purging any person with any amount of influence that may have sympathies to the other side or can't be trusted. Because you recall, I think it was when we had Vile Varanian on, we talked about Medvedchuk's media outlets being shut down. Now, Medvedchuk is a member of the Ukrainian parliament who ran media outlets that actually were very pro-Russian, sort of advocated the Eastern Slavs, whether that be Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, as all one nation rather than separate nations. He came from that school of thought, which isn't unreasonable if you think about it.
Hmm.
And again, his last name is distinctly Ukrainian or Ruthenian or whatever you'll call it. It's distinctly
Yeah.
not Russian, and he still holds those views. So he's been under U.S. sanctions for quite some time, I also believe. But again, you're going to see various figures that are inconvenient to them, whether they're too pro Russia or just cannot be trusted, being stripped of their power. And they're going to try to paint this as some great anti corruption campaign, even though, let's see, Ukrainian presidents, they have a term of 6 years, correct? I think that's what
Yeah.
the Ukrainian president has. So he'll be due for election in like 4 years. So we got till like 2025 until he's out of office, unless he gets driven out or impeached or whatever the removal process is over in Ukraine. Because Ukrainian presidents have historically not lasted more than one term. The only one to be reelected was Yanukovych, who was promptly overthrown. So we're seeing all this come together. We're seeing this chaos come out of Ukraine at a time where you'd really expect it. It looks like Biden is trying to really, I guess you could say, repay some favors because a lot of Ukrainian oligarchs went for not only Hillary but Biden and a lot of the Ukrainian oligarchs, which they're not really Ukrainian as we've previously discussed, very embedded within the Democratic establishment for some reason. You recall Vindman, who was more of a military man, but still, you have these very interesting characters that all come from Ukraine, aren't exactly Ukrainians, and very entrenched in American politics on the Democratic side. Really makes you think, doesn't it?
Right, right. But also there was a figure that was now he's one of these men you would least expect to be siding with Ukrainian neo-Nazis, given his ethnic background. However, he was at the January 6th riot, and I forget his name, but I have seen pictures of this guy through the years on various blog posts, you know, dealing with what happened, uh, in Ukraine in 2014, and it is very strange. I only have his photo. I think I had one article on him, but it was very weird that he was there. Bizarre. But you do see these crossovers, where you have like people who um, you can see that the right in America sometimes wants, or at least let's say American intelligence agencies want the right in America and in Europe to empathize with the right in Ukraine for obvious expedient geopolitical reasons, right? And one of the things that they're particularly afraid of is that a significant portion of the American right actually uh, sides with Russia, that it sides with conservative movements within Poland and Hungary, that it sides with Assad, right? This is very problematic, and it's kind of like the same way that American media, let's say Fox particularly, tries to get the right wing in America to always side with Israel,
Yeah, I was
right?
actually about
They
to
can
say it's
have
sort of like
whatever
how
amount
after
of
after 9/11 it was acceptable to discriminate against Muslims for not being liberal enough, for not respecting women's rights
yes.
or LGBT whatever rights. But if you criticize them for not being Westerners or not being Christians, that's where they drew the line. Sort of in the same context, you cannot side with conservative movements in Poland and Hungary and Russia, but you're allowed to sympathize with these far right Ukrainians because it's expedient for us.
Yeah, exactly.
But it looks like as I was expecting, they're really going to push this Ukraine issue. This is going to be one of Biden's biggest things. I wonder if he's trying to get another one of his kids, or maybe I don't know, maybe it's a nephew this time. I wonder if he's trying to get them a job somewhere. As we know, whatever Biden kid needs a job, you gotta go straight to the source. You gotta take a trip to Kiev or Odessa, one of these big population hubs. It's just how it works, you know.
Oh, by the way, I have the name of the guy, that Ukrainian operative who has taken photos with Right Sector, and he has like this T-shirt on in one of the photos of like the Star of David plus the Ukrainian trident. However, the photo that was taken of his name is, by the way, Dybynyn, Dybynnyn,
Yes,
and
I
he
know
was at the
exactly who you're
Capitol.
talking about
Yeah,
now.
you know who I mean. And he was taken a picture of with the QAnon shaman. so,
Oh
so
no.
it's very odd.
Yeah, you're allowed to sympathize with these guys, but don't export their taxes over here. That's not. Don't import their taxes over here. You're not allowed to do that. That's where we draw the line. But with that being said, apparently we got some news out of Georgia, and by Georgia we mean the Caucasian Republic and not the American state. Now you were telling me about this, so why don't you let our audience in on this eerily familiar story? I would say.
Yes, the tale of two Georges. So I know this kind of flew right over everybody's heads, and Western media did not report it. But in October of 2020, Georgia had an election, and it was very much a contested election, and this very much in the same way that the U.S. election was. The side, um, which is the United National Movement, which was the opposition party, lost and claimed that the vote was fraudulent, the election was illegitimate. Now, the EU has said that it was a compromised election. However, it was still legitimate. Just love that. It's like that article that was written by Time where, like, yes, we manipulated everything, but it was still a completely legitimate election. Um, so the story goes something like this. Um, the opposition did not recognize it. They went on a boycott, and then things really came to a head on February the 23rd this year. So it's not that long ago. Georgian police basically broke into the offices of the UNM, the opposition party, which whose leader is Nika Melia, and for basically just political charges. Melia was arrested by the former defense minister Irikai Gabrashvili, and he's the one who assumed the position of prime minister. Now, his predecessor, Georgi Garkaria, resigned over plans to also arrest Melia. So he refused to do that. Garibashvili is elected, and he does arrest him. This has created a crisis, so much so that the Atlantic Council had a 1.5 hour Zoom call in order to deal with this, and it was spectacular to watch because the woman, I forget her name, who represented the opposition, of course, towed the line and said that we recognize that the election results were legitimate. However, concessions by the ruling party have to be made, and we need a new election as fast as possible. And she cited that a similar event had happened in Armenia in the past, as well as in Georgia, where quick elections are called for when something like this happens. However, Gabrashvili is not interested in doing that, and so it's deepening this crisis. So there's been protests over it. You hear virtually nothing about it, and the number one fear that they have is that Russia is going to take advantage of it. In fact, sorry, you had his name. I forgot his name. The leader of the Russian Communist Party,
Zhuganov.
Zhuganov. So Zhuganov actually paid a visit, and this sent a firestorm, at least in that part of the world. How could a guy who's not even a leader of a nation visit the parliament? And so they're terrified right now that
Hey,
Russian
it's another
influence
guy who
is.
got cheated out of an election visiting the people who got cheated out of an election.
I know, I know. Again, tale of two Georges. So it's interesting that the story has been ignored. We know why, because it's another story of a fraudulent election, a tampered election. We put up with 4 years of this nonsense, impeachments, ridiculous stories and assumptions that never panned out, and now, with lots of evidence of voter tampering and manipulation with the help of corporate media to determine the results of the election. No, we're not going to talk about that. So it's obvious why they have been quiet as far as the news media front is concerned, but why it's so serious that NATO's think tank, which is what the Atlantic Council is, felt it necessary to have a meeting and to broadcast this. And if you watch the video, like I would highly recommend it. At least stick for the first third. You're going to see this kind of back and forth between one of the official party, like the victorious party, basically argued that Georgia has made many strides, and we have a lot of work. Yes, but let's not forget the strides. And then you have the indignant opposition saying, like, what are you talking about? We look like a joke right now. Of course, it doesn't even occur to her that something similar like that happened in America, right? So, yeah, very interesting tidbit. Another big concern was Russia's entrenchment in Nagorno-Karabakh. So this is further stoked fears, and it is creating a certain amount of destabilization over and above the political issues facing Georgia right now. and they're afraid. They're afraid of this push, um, this pull rather from Russia. That they're, you don't know. In 10 years, Georgia could produce another great Georgian leader for Russia. We just don't know.
Now wait a minute. Yes, the Georgian Oblast could produce yet another great leader who who history does not necessarily repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme, as they say. And with that being said, you do have to love the parallels of the contested election, the opposition party taking some drastic measures, the events with their parliament, and just all topped off by the fact that at the Capitol protests, apparently somebody must have ordered the flag still had creases in it, so somebody ordered the wrong Georgian flag. Rather than the state, they had the country, the white background flag with the red cross down the middle and the four crosses in each quadrant. Very nice flag, I do have to admit. It's one of
It is lovely.
I think it's one of the nicest flags of modern states. It has some actual character, but that's really aside the point here. But I I love this story because it encapsulates everything the show is about. Everything we have spent the past 3 years at this point talking about. The first episode released of this, which unfortunately has been lost to time, was about 3 years ago when we did this.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we've been trucking along on this path for a while, and this story just encapsulates everything I talk about. Now I think it's time to return to our roots and get into some Middle Eastern news. So
Yes, definitely.
it's been a busy week in Syria, more than
Oh yeah.
usual, but heavy Russian strikes, Turkish activities, Turkish
Hmm.
shelling, U.S. convoys, and I think the biggest news out of Syria, what I will start with, is oil trade between the
Yes.
SDF controlled areas in the north and the Syrian government proper have halted. Now, keep in mind the oil trade is mostly controlled by the SDF. That's where most of the Syrian oil fields are. Not that there isn't any beyond that other side of the Euphrates. You can even see on the map the little red oil rigs right there, which are conveniently close to a pocket of ISIS. You ever notice that? But
Yes.
there we are, and of course, Russia, to react to this, has been shipping their own oil to them for years from the Crimea, and more recently, Russian ships have been guarding Iranian tankers en route to Syria. So we're seeing that activity develop. We're seeing the Russian Navy taking a more active role with that. With the
Well,
previous,
we should mention also that I mean, as long as you bring up Russia and Iran, I just want to interject that Russia and Iran have signed an intelligence cooperation right now for counterintelligence insurgencies. So it's a really big deal.
hmm, I heard something about that. I was going to get into that when we get more to our Iran news
Yeah.
with Biden, Kamala, and Netanyahu. But Russian ships have now taken it upon themselves to guard Iranian tankers en route to Syria. So we are seeing that develop now. It doesn't seem like these tankers have been seized or any false flag attacks or even real attacks have happened to these tankers since. But the big outrage right now is liberals are really trying to drum up because one of these Russian airstrikes allegedly killed 4 civilians, which, admittedly, you know, war does come with civilian casualties. And here's the big cope for it. War obviously comes with civilian casualties, especially in our modern era with shelling, with bombing. But number one, it looks like they're fighting an actual terrorist group. Now, keep in mind what they claim about Gaza is everything they claim about Gaza is true about Idlib. Whereas the groups there, they do legitimately use civilians as human shields. Number
Yes.
two, it can be more easily wiped away when your country actually has a reason for being there. Very few Americans, if any, even among the establishment, have no idea what we're doing in Syria. So when you hear that American strikes harmed or killed civilians, you wonder, well, what the hell was the point of that? Because people can stomach that news when, for example, let's say the early days of Afghanistan, when we're in a war that at least the American public thinks has a purpose. Nobody sees the purpose of Syria. That's what the outrage is about that. But ultimately, you can tell with this is, yeah, especially in a civil war, a lot of civilian casualties happen with the urbanized warfare you have in Syria. But the fact that they're clamoring on this story so much is for obvious reasons. It is because they want to push further. This is after the strikes on the Iranian groups, which allegedly killed 0 civilians, which again, you can dispute that claim, what that Biden carried out. And then they came out with a story almost simultaneously that Biden had another strike plan on Iranian groups in Syria, but called it off because civilians would be caught in the crossfire. Yeah, yeah. It definitely happened. That totally happened. But sort of like it's sort of like when Trump was going to strike Iran over the downed drone. He said, "Well, I looked at the numbers and I realized the risk for civilian casualties would be too high." Right after Iran threatened to unleash their missiles on American forces in the region. So again, it's one of those sort of stories. Except they eat it up with Biden. They like, oh, sure, he did Trump with the other one, but again, that's all to be expected. And the other big news out of Syria is Washington has affirmed after talks with Turkey that they will continue to work towards mutual goals in Syria. So it looks like the Biden administration or Kamala or whoever is trying to court Turkey again back into the American camp to get Turkey to more or less enforce American interests within Syria and
Yeah,
get them to
which
do the
is
heavy lifting that they currently cannot do.
right, because they'll ignore it if the Turks do it, and it's something that I already predicted would. That we both predicted would happen with the Biden administration. That there was no other way, um, to win the war in the long run without Turkey is impossible. But I should mention, speaking of oil trade, um, there was an illegal oil trade. I mean, there still is. It's not what it was in 2015, but there is an illegal oil trade from Syria into Turkey, and both Syria and Russia targeted them and blew up actually quite a few of these convoy trucks recently. So, um, that's a no-no. I'm glad they've stepped up. I'm glad they're more proactive about it. Um, it probably means that their attention isn't as divided. Um, of course, it is perpetually divided, but not to the same extent as it was with the ISIS insurgency last year.
Yeah, especially back in 2015 when they still controlled half of the country. Like most of the
Yeah,
Kurdish-controlled areas in 2000, most of the Kurdish-controlled areas today in 2015 were under the control of ISIS and other affiliated groups, and we discussed that.
yeah,
They were a controlled burn. They were allowed to wreak havoc there because it allowed the SDF, the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, to control everything east of the Euphrates at that point. It has
yeah.
been deliberately done that way, and there's really not much more you can say about it in that regard. But yeah, it looks like Turkey is stepping up its role again. It looks like Washington is really again, taking a gamble on Turkey, but there's not really much else they can do at this point, short of an all-out intervention, which is also not very tenable. But
Yeah, and Turkey has interests that don't align with the U.S., particularly when it comes to the Kurds.
oh, especially, and as we said, the only reason Turkish presence in Syria, Turkish action in its region is tolerated is because Turkey is viewed as a quote unquote lesser evil than allowing Russian influence to expand. The minute they don't need Turkey, if that ever comes, it's it's game over for them. I mean, I'm not saying that Turkey would be an easy regime change by any means, but I mean, hell, they already tried it even at a crucial time. Obama tried to overthrow Erdogan even in the middle of the Syrian civil war
Yeah,
and right after they shot down a Russian plane. So that just shows the level of discontent between Washington and Ankara that I don't know, maybe it's because Obama realized, hey, it's not my problem. I won't have to deal with this in 6 months, so I might as well try it. But
mhm.
who knows? But point being is, Syria, things have continued on. Expect more news about Assad's atrocities and Russian atrocities in Syria as the conflict comes to a close in northeastern Syria. Expect them to keep their mouths shut about Turkey or conversely raise outrage about the Kurds and weep over the Kurds and how Turkey is mistreating them or how Syria is mistreating them or whatever. But just expect more of the same ratcheted up. They're really going to try to push this in these next few months here, I believe. Unless, of course, some major domestic issue breaks out, which, those have been very abundant over the past year and a half, but
Hmm.
that's aside the point. Now, moving on to some of the other Middle Eastern news. Now, before we get into Iran, I will say that the Houthis, Ansar Allah, whatever you want to call them, it's fundamentally the same group or same coalition of groups, have made strikes at airports in southern Saudi Arabia and at other targets in Saudi Arabia, and it only seems to be increasing. It only seems that Saudi Arabia looks weaker and weaker as time goes on, which, as we discussed, economically it's weaker, militarily it's the weakest link in the Middle East in terms of the pro-American coalition. Even these smaller states you would think, like the UAE, they still maintain pretty robust militaries, all things considered, for their size and for their population. But again, it looks like Saudi Arabia is just continuing to get hammered by these guys who can hardly afford to wear shoes. And of course, that goes back to the Iranian support, the smuggling in of missiles, if you will. And really, I would not be surprised if Saudi Arabia collapses within the next 2 years. I'm not saying it's
Mm.
going to happen now, but I mean, imagine if there's another prolonged oil crisis, like, for example, what we saw in the 1970s, where relations with America are strained, or for whatever reason, they cannot or will not trade oil with America, or I suppose China is another factor. But suppose some crisis uh, on the same level of the, let's say, 1973 crisis breaks out. Do you think Saudi Arabia could survive that again? Do you think Saudi Arabia has it in them
Mm.
again to survive another months long crisis? I don't think they do. And I don't
Yeah.
think
No.
that another months long crisis is too far of the question. I'm not saying it's going to happen next week. It very could happen next week. I wouldn't be surprised at this rate. But I think we're never going to see a crisis like 1973, or I don't know, maybe like 78 or 79 later, the second one in that decade. But point being is, I think we're going to see some sort of energy crisis within the next 2 to 3 years here.
Yeah, I mean, I think America will do everything it can to prop up Saudi Arabia. I cannot see them giving up. Um,
And like we said,
th-
even the Chinese have some vested interest in the Saudi stand.
yes.
So they have two of the world's largest players behind them. It looks like the only country that could really put screws to them is Russia. The only country that could put the screws to them and is willing to is Russia. But I mean, we've seen their oil wars before. We saw that last spring, last April it was. So, but again, I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe it won't be an energy crisis exactly, but some crisis in the Middle East may push Saudi Arabia to the brink. Now, what will come out of that, I don't know. But point being is, I really don't see how this entity, this political entity, is has much life left in it, in its current form at least.
Hmm.
And yeah, the great reformer Mohammed bin Salman, it looks like his reforms have done wonders, really addressed a lot of the problems, and not definitely dug Saudi Arabia further into the hole. But with all that being said, to close out, we will talk a little bit about Iran, because Iran said they're ready to cooperate as Rouhani calls for more practical steps from the U.S. Now, this is after his proxy groups got struck in Syria. It looks like they're doing this tango. Now, I figured with Iranian elections relatively soon in 2022, I believe, that Rouhani would be going for a bit more of a hardline approach, saying we need to stand up to this. The Americans stabbed us in the back once before, and they'll do it again. But it looks like he's trying to salvage his legacy of the Iran deal, which isn't too surprising. But again, I wasn't necessarily expecting it, and we had a phone call between Kamala Harris and Benjamin Netanyahu, where Netanyahu said Israel will not allow Iran to attain nuclear weapons. Now, as we've discussed previously, I think Iran is on the path to nuclear weapons, especially after the Iran deal was scrapped, that they really see no alternative than to have a nuclear deterrence of their own. And I say, yeah, that's probably going to happen at this point. Iran could have built a nuclear device for decades, and I think they've finally been pushed to the point where they actually will. Now, I know Israel is rather concerned about it, more concerned than they've ever been, even more concerned than Netanyahu's presentation at the UN with the bomb chart saying, "Well, Iran is right here now, but if we wait, they will be right here." Like, I think we're beyond that point. And I'm really curious what Netanyahu's next UN speech is going to look like, if he gets another UN speech at this rate. Even though it looks like the Biden administration and the Netanyahu administration, it looks like they've come to an understanding that previously was not seen between Netanyahu and Obama. As we discussed, Netanyahu did praise Biden for these strikes on Syria. So I don't know. We could see that happening, but it looks like Israel, and it could all just be rhetoric because Netanyahu is on the rocks politically. Him saying Iran will not be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon, or again, this sort of drivel he usually throws out. And on top of that, you mentioned the further cooperation with Russia in terms of intelligence and counterinsurgency and operations like that. So I suppose we'll see how that all pans out, now won't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's still undetermined. I know. I mean, I might have to eat my words or my hat. Uh, I said that the JPCOA is basically dead. I still at the moment stand by that.
Oh, I do too.
Um, yeah, I mean, there's some negotiating going on, but I cannot see how. Um, I just I can't see how Iran can go back. All things considered, um, especially after the assassination of Soleimani, especially the assassination of their lead scientist, uh, you know, probably by Mossad or the U.S. For their nuclear development program. This has happened before. Uh, I mean, they have a public that they have to look strong to as well. They, they can't they can't afford to look weak in front of the
Especially as a
U.S.
besieged nation, because the U.S.,
Yeah,
the American population will tolerate looking a bit foolish on the world stage. It's nothing we're not used to. But if Iran looks weak, to the Iranian people at least, it could be a matter of national survival. Of are we going to suffer the same fate a country like Iraq or Syria or Libya has? So the
right,
stakes, I would say, are
right.
much higher on in terms of that for somebody like Rouhani and the Iranian leadership than it is for the American leadership. Because I don't know, maybe I am overestimating America at this point in terms of our political stability, but at least in previous years we could weather a little bit of egg on our face. But as I said, it could be a matter of will our government survive long enough to see the new year for
Mhm.
somebody like Iran or a country like Iran.
Right, and there's the division, the line of division is now becoming clearer than it was 4 years ago. Um, I don't recall 4 years ago China condemning the U.S. and EU for whatever sanction was placed on Russia involving, whatever, a case of Novichok or whatnot. But now with the Navalny uh, scandal, China has come out and slammed the U.S. and the EU, even with Biden being in power, over the new sanctions that are going to be placed on Russia over the supposed Novichok poisoning of Navalny. Um, and you mentioned Austria's minister Karen Knessel. She's moved on to Rosneft, and the leader of the board at Rosneft is Gerhard Schroeder. Um, so divisions are now becoming clearer, and there's um, with Iran and Russia working together on intelligence, that's for me, another clear sign that things are becoming less ambiguous, more explicit rather than implicit.
Absolutely, and I do think I think we're seeing a lot of things come together, and I would say we may get a restoration of the JCPOA that is on paper only, where they, or at least their delegations, smile and shake hands, and they sign some sort of patchwork agreement that says we're officially ceasing tensions, but keep on
Yeah,
keep on each other behind the scenes. For example, in Syria, in Yemen, almost similar to what Obama did after the initial signing of the Iran deal. So,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately America has to provide a deal that's palatable to Iran.
yeah,
Like,
even if they have no intention of living up to it, and that's a lot of diplomacy. That's a lot of treaties. A deal, at
mhm.
least quite literally on paper, that looks good to both sides, enough for them to say, "Oh, we had a great diplomatic breakthrough," before they go back to business as usual, which I would say is probably the most likely outcome.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I would.
suppose with all that being said, that is a wrap for this week. A very interesting news week. Not to be confused with the publication. Of course, we have no affiliation with them. We have no affiliation with any mainstream media outlet, and let that be known. Let that be known for now, and for the rest of the show's history, that we will not and we will never have an association with a mainstream media outlet. I don't care how much you're paying. I don't care I don't care who you're blackmailing me with or what you're blackmailing me with. It ain't happening. I'm sorry, but I hope you guys enjoyed this completely independent program, mind you. And I guess we'll see you next week, or whenever we do a show next. Yeah, probably next week. Looks like these Saturday time slots have been working out pretty good. It looks like you guys have been enjoying them. So I suppose we'll see you next time, and goodbye.
Take care.